Hey everyone, this is the introduction to Peter Beilharz, Trotskyism, and the transition to socialism. Um, Probably just gonna sometimes when I read books and put them up on the YouTube channel, I have them like chapter one, chapter two, chapter three, and so on. But I don't even know if I'm gonna read this whole book, but I am gonna read sections from it. So I'll probably just kind of put them up on the YouTube channel as if they're kind of like essays or like standalone pieces. Yeah, that was quite a chug of a water chug right there, but I'm thirsty. Anyway, the title of the introduction is Trotsky and the Jacobin Legacy. The first section is called, quote, Good and Bad Citizens, end quote. Leon Trotsky has passed into popular imagination as the Man of October, the hyper-Bolshevik, and later as the Romantic in exile, spurned equally by the regime which he had helped to create and the capitalist societies which he vilified. But there is another forgotten Trotsky who began his political life differently. Before October, Trotsky shared in the political culture of the Second International. Trotsky imbibed its cosmopolitanism, its enthusiasm for education and enlightenment. This was a world in which socialism was seen to be inevitable, in which Marxism was a science no less than Darwinism, a world where progress was believed to forge onward unabated, where the mass was seen as being the party, where a whole growing socialist community would exist within the bowels of bourgeois society, debating in Die Neuzeit, reading anthropology, awaiting the carcass of capitalist civilization to rot, arguing about the necessity or irrelevance of the general strike to finishing the process. Trotsky's politics in this milieu were spontaneist. His self-conception was that of the revolutionary intellectual rather than the professional revolutionary. Like Rosa Luxemburg, Trotsky stood apart from others, not least of all because of Trotsky's concern with prefigurative politics. Most significantly, the young Trotsky was a Democrat, a vehement opponent of Jacobinism, the very tradition which he was later so brilliantly to extend. Ironically, then, given the accepted images of Trotsky, his political career began with the vilification of Bolshevism. The central vehicle of his polemic against Lenin, the 1904 missal Our Political Tasks, still awaits an English translation. One can understand why. Our Political Tasks is a vitriolic and is as vitriolic and penetrating as any polemic to come from the pen of the later Trotsky. Only its object is the very politics which he later came to make canon. Trotsky here severed Lenin's claim that Jacobinism and social democracy could be amalgamated. Jacobinism was a specific historical product, Trotsky claimed, which had no substantial compatibility with the socialist project as he then identified it. Trotsky repeated earlier allegations that Lenin was Robespierre, caricatured. Jacobinism represented the acme of bourgeois radicalism. In theory, the rights of man and citizen, in practice, the guillotine. Bolshevism had a decapitationist logic, according to Trotsky. Robespierre's maxim, quote, I know only of two parties, good and bad citizens, end quote, was inscribed on Lenin's heart. The Bolsheviks consequently represented disaster for Russian social democracy. Presenting themselves as agents of proletarian liberation, they would produce rather dictatorship over the proletariat. Who, after October, would recognize Trotsky in these words? Certainly not the Trotskyist tradition, which reduced our political tasks to our political tasks, much celebrated qualms about, quote, substitutionism, end quote, which Trotsky intended against Lenin, but could now be directed retrospectively against the demonic Stalin. For Trotsky's own trajectory into Bolshevism saw Trotsky elevate just this maxim of Robespierre, quote, good and bad citizens, end quote, into a Marxist cosmology, adding the signifiers, quote, proletarian, end quote, to good, and, quote, bourgeois, end quote, to bad credentials, respectively. This lapse into Jacobinism can be witnessed in Trotskyism, however, not only in the perilous period of war communism, but also through the 30s. It becomes a permanent motif in the Trotskyist tradition because it is a lasting feature of Trotsky's Bolshevism. Even the latter, Trotsky's few doubts about this tradition never became substantial. Trotsky's Jacobin credentials are evident not only in terrorism and communism, but also later in Their Morals and Ours and In Defense of Marxism. Terrorism and Communism remains a fascinating work, as H.N. Brailsford put it, quote, by far the most typical expression of the Bolshevik temperament which the revolution had produced. Okay. End quote. I'm going to see if there's anything on Wikipedia for this Brailsford fellow. H.N. Brailsford was a British journalist and writer considered one of the most prolific left-wing journalists of the first half of the 20th century. A founding member of the Men's League for Women's Suffrage in 1907, he resigned from his job at the Daily News in 1909 when it supported the force-feeding of suffragettes on hunger strike. Sounds like an interesting man. That's H.N. Brailsford. Back to the text. Max Shachtman, if you follow this channel, you know who Max Shachtman is. Max Shachtman concurs. It is a high terrorism and communism is a high Bolshevik text, but importantly not an aberrant one compared to Trotsky's later thought. In it, Trotsky rebukes Kautsky's work of the same name. Trotsky denounces the idea he had earlier advocated, that Bolshevism viewed itself as the sole repository of the truth. Trotsky lambasts the idea of democracy, itself so central to our political tasks. Our political tasks. Trotsky denies the substitutionism thesis. Trotsky's defense of revolutionary terror in the Russian Revolution introduces the notion of ... good and bad citizens, or at least good and bad classes. Terrorism directed toward the bad classes is historically and politically necessary, therefore proper. Similarly, Trotsky decrees that there are good and bad newspapers, good and bad Taylorism, good and bad armies. Here the dualism of the Enlightenment are refracted into public life. Dualisms of the Enlightenment are refracted into public life via state power. The language used by Trotsky to put his case is that of Jacobinism, though it also has other connotations for denizens of the 20th century. Quote, to make the individual sacred, we must destroy the social order which crucifies the individual, and this problem can only be solved by blood and iron, end quote. The language decisively expelled from argument by the early Trotsky has returned with a vengeance, as the Bolshevism which the young Trotsky declared degenerate is now alleged to be amalgamated with the Russian proletariat. Trotsky's Jacobinism may be especially vociferous in the period of war communism, but Trotsky's Jacobinism is by no means limited to the period of war communism. In Their Morals and Ours, published in 1938, the same dualisms are introduced. Morality has a class character. There are only good and bad citizens. Them and us. ... Morality is a closed matter. Morality lies with the proletariat, and by historic delegation with the party. In Defense of Marxism reveals a similar logic. Trotsky's dualistic approach to morals is here taken to its logical conclusion. The opposition within the party must have a class basis for the opposition within the party's mistaken views. It is found to be that of the petty bourgeoisie, the declining class which must now choose whether to affiliate with the good or bad citizens. While I'm concurrently reading this, this is it's talking about in defense of Marxism, but this is absolutely correct. This is what basically the argument against Jacobinism. When I'm reading in defense of Marxism, I feel like I'm seeing very little substantive argument and just kind of like hurls of accusations about petty bourgeois eclecticism or faulty understanding of dialectical materialism as being like the main like things that he says against the opposition that's forming in the Socialist Workers' Party, which in defense of Marxism is all about criticizing, right? It's all about criticizing Burnham, Shachtman, and Aburn, who would later form the Workers' Party, Burnham leaving the Workers' Party soon afterwards and becoming like a right-winger, or not like, but becoming a right-winger, a Cold Warrior. But that's like the whole thing is like that is precisely it. The opposition within the party must have a class basis for its mistaken views. It is found to be that of the petty bourgeoisie, the declining class, which must now choose whether to affiliate with the good or bad citizens. I mean, that's exactly right. The kind of like instead of like trying to take arguments head on, it's just kind of like this like I don't know, very crass, reductive, class reductive, sociological analysis about who uh, the opposition tendency in the party represent, which is ostensibly is the petty bourgeoisie. Anyway, but yeah, I'm just saying from my limited experience, because I don't come from a Trotskyist background, um, that observation about Trotsky, based on just like the text I've been reading, seems very apt. Anyway, uncertainty and disagreement. Here are petty bourgeois traits. For the disappearing class must surely have vacillating positions such as, quote, ... a disdainful attitude toward theory, bracket, exclamation point, end bracket, and an inclination toward eclecticism, disrespect for the tradition of their own organization, anxiety for personal, quote, independence, end quote, at the expense of anxiety for objective truth, nervousness instead of consistency, readiness to jump from one position to another, lack of understanding of revolutionary centralism, and hostility toward revolutionary centralism, ... end quote. All in contrast to proletarian dialectics. Where am I? Sorry. Dialectics had by now come to mean the apologetic hat tricks which Trotsky already had some weakness. For which Trotsky already had some weakness. In terrorism and communism, for example, Trotsky had put the latter notorious case that the proletarian state withered and intensified at the same time. Yet within the space of years, Trotsky's Jacobin image of man as a lazy animal needing coercion is supplanted by the ideal of Olympian self-perfection in Literature and Revolution. That's a piece by Trotsky. In Literature and Revolution, Trotsky posits the developmental face of Jacobinism, his image of perfection from above, introduced by the cultural Superman of socialism, the Faustian technologist carving up nature, rationalizing and planning everything which moves as well as nature's inert being. Trotsky's is a vision of ultramodernism, very much contiguous with that analyzed by Berman in his book, All That Is Solid Melts into Air. I think Berman was like a Marxist humanist. I think that All That Is Solid Melts in the Air is a book from the 70s, I believe. I'll read the little introduction. It says, All That Solid Melts into Air, The Experience of Modernity is a book by Marshall Berman, written between 1971 and 1981 and published in New York City in 1982. The book examines social and economic modernization and its conflicting relationship with modernism. The title of the book is taken from Samuel Moore's 1888 translation of the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Berman uses Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's Faust as a literary interpretation of modernization through the process of dreaming, loving, and developing. In the second section, Berman uses Marx's text to analyze the self-destructive nature of modernization. In the third section, French poetry, especially Charles Baudelaire, is used as a model of modernist writing, followed by a selection of Russian literature, Alexander Pushkin, Fyodor Dostoevsky, Andrei Bely, Nikolai Gogol, Osip Mandelstam. In the fourth section, the book concludes with some notes on modernism in New York City during the 1960s and 1970s. New York City's subway map is said to have been designed in accordance with Berman's vision of modernity presented in the book. Berman recalls, quote, "It was a thrill when the man who had designed New York's marvelous subway map came up to me on Broadway and said that all the time he was putting his map together, he had tried to keep my book in mind." End quote. Yeah. And here it says, Marshall Howard Berman was an American philosopher and Marxist humanist writer. Berman was a distinguished professor of political science at the City College of New York and at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, teaching political philosophy and urbanism. That's who Berman is. I can't, check every reference that is made in the book, but I like to do that when I'm not sure myself. So I'm sorry if there's things that I mention and don't look into, or maybe just inappropriately assume people know what's being referenced. Anyway, let me get back to the text. Trotsky's is a vision of ultramodernism very much contiguous with that analyzed by Berman in his book, All That Is Solid Melts into Air. Trotsky shares with Faust even the commitment to militarization of labor, so that the will to reason might finally come to temporal fruition. Trotsky's messianism iconically grows inversely as the Soviet situation deteriorates. When Trotsky had been completely routed, among Trotsky's last words to the Central Committee were these, quote, "Expel me, but you will not prevent the victory of the opposition," end quote. Trotsky could not conceive that history was not on his side, and so in a period of decay and defeat could nevertheless let his imagination soar to utopian heights. Supermen socialists were therefore concocted by Trotsky in an environment where, even a decade later, quote, "you can't find decent buttons," end quote, and where, quote, "on our most important highway, automobiles can make only 10 kilometers an hour," end quote. Yet Trotsky assures the reader that these supermen will be, quote, "stronger and wiser and subtler," end quote. More musical in style and voice, excelling even Aristotle, Goethe, and Marx. Heroic individuals populate Trotsky's mind, while the masses toiled on for their bread. The conception of history here in Trotsky was aristocratic. New section. Trotsky and the French Revolution. Trotsky's post-October arguments have a direct relationship to the French Revolution, or at least to the Bolshevik conception of it. As we have seen, the young Trotsky had nothing but contempt for Jacobin social democracy, and made this judgment on moral and historiographical grounds alike. In a contemporaneous text, Results and Prospects from 1905, Trotsky elaborated his historiographical principles and detailed his reservations about universalizing the French Revolution as though the French Revolution were a general typology. Trotsky argued, rather, for the unique specificity of experiences, like the experiences which occurred in 1789, 1848, and 1905. After Trotsky's conversion to Bolshevism, and in response to the attack on his own Bolshevik credentials, Trotsky, however, openly embraced this notion of the universality of the great French experience. As is well known, Trotsky came to parallel the entire process of Soviet, quote, degeneration, end quote, with the alleged master plan of the French Revolution, popularizing notions like Thermidor to explain his own political defeat. This language had awkward resonances, for Trotsky himself had of course earlier been cast as an aspiring Bonaparte. In 1926, Trotsky was prepared to justify his own record before the Central Control Commission in precisely Jacobin terms. Trotsky now finally recognized the real affinity between Jacobinism and Bolshevism, though at the historiographical expense of collapsing Jacobinism and Bolshevism's two revolutions. Trotsky argued that the history of the French Revolution ought now be mandatory reading for party members, as the Russian Revolution had followed in the French Revolution's path. The crucial thing, Trotsky argued against Comrade Zoltz, was that like the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, too, was divided into two chapters, one of ascendancy, followed by another of decline. Quote, none of us is scared by firing squads, ... but the thing is to know whom to shoot and in accordance with which chapter, end quote. Shooting enemies of the revolution in the chapter of ascent was quite normal and in accordance with history's general plot. Trotsky's defense is intriguing, but Trotsky's defense's significance may have been lost on an audience which had already identified the left opposition as bad citizens, and this despite or even because of the generalized influence of the French Revolution among Russian radicals. Trotsky's trajectory illustrates the power of metaphysical thinking in socialist historiography, and also its weakness. Fourier has explained some of the problems involved in his important study interpreting the French Revolution. Fourier argues that the French and Russian revolutions have been forcibly made mutually reflexive and constitutive by left historians. Quote, the historiographical discourses about the two revolutions became fused and infected each other. The Bolsheviks were given Jacobin ancestors, and the Jacobins were made to anticipate the communists, end quote. Yeah, just let me look up this name real quick. If it's important. Francois Fourier was a French historian and president of the Saint-Simon Foundation and best known for his books on the French Revolution. From 1985 to 1997, Fourier was professor of French history at the University of Chicago. Fourier was elected to the Académie Française in March 1997, just 3 months before he died in July. So that's who Fourier is. Anyway, back to the text. More, Fourier argues, the French Revolution, understood in this typological sense, never occurred. To illustrate the problem, Fourier conjures up an image of his own. Bolshevism and Jacobinism, he says, have been treated as two successive, quote, liberations, end quote, nested like a set of Russian dolls. More specifically, Fourier argues that it is only with the French Revolution that leftist politics develops its own novel language of truth and falsehood, good and evil, good citizens and bad citizens, Bolsheviks and traitors, ... The problems are not unique to Trotskyism. Indeed, Fourier discusses them rather with reference to the dominant communist tradition of historiography in France. But these problems need to be separated out from the problems in Marx's own historiography. As Feher has shown, As Feher has shown, the French revolutions were decisively influential as models for Marx's politics. Further, it is now widely recognized that Marx's historiography or philosophy of history was deeply metaphorical itself. Hayden White, for example, has shown how fundamental was Marx's reliance on the device of metonymy, while Alvin Goldner has argued that Marxism is definitionally metaphorical. Metonymy is the substitution of the name of an attribute or adjunct for that of the thing meant. For example, suit for business executive, or the track for horse racing. Metonymy is a figure of speech in which a concept is referred to by the name of something closely associated with that thing or concept. Back to the text. It was Marx, of course, who described French history in tragicomic form. He spoke of revolution as the, quote, old mole, end quote, who, steeped in classical literature, structured even his most systematic work, Capital, through the imagery of Shakespeare, Goethe, and Dante. But because Marx eschewed Jacobinism, Marx never spoke of good and bad citizens, nor did Marx make the fatal mistake of identifying history with party or state, despite the clearly teleological nature of Marx's historiography. Marx, like the young Trotsky, refused history a terrestrial expression in the form of a vanguard. The situation in the theory of the Bolshevik Trotsky, and in Trotskyism generally, is different. This is so not only because of Trotskyism's substitution in the chains of, quote, representative, end quote, logic, which bind together history, class, party, and leadership, nor even primarily because of the implication of Trotskyism in the Soviet experience. More fundamental here is the Jacobin anthropology, which Marx never entertained. As Feher explains, the central political feature of Jacobinism is the principle of the anthropological perfectibility of man, understood as a condition to be implemented from above. Though thinking primarily of Lenin and Trotsky, Feher extends his judgment on Jacobinism. Quote, all revolutionary leaders have combined radical voluntarism and anthropological pessimism, end quote. On this view, Jacobinism combines a public doctrine, the uncritically held notion of human perfectibility, with a secret doctrine, a desperate pessimism which can be traced back genealogically to Rousseau. Of conceptual teleology, Marx was certainly guilty, and frequently. Marx was convinced that socialist revolution was imminent to capitalist development, and in this Marx was conspicuously mistaken. Neither the historical des ex machina of his writings on French history, nor the conceptual dialectics of Capital in Grundrisse, nor yet again the historical telos imputed to the proletariat in the manifesto or in the penultimate chapter of Capital have any substantive basis. Trotskyism shares with Marx this historically deceptive, if politically innocent, metaphorical basis, but it mediates it necessarily through two further categories to which Marx was indifferent, if not hostile: party and Soviet state. That's parenthesis, Soviet and parenthesis state. Whereas history remains in a sense an abstract universal for Marx, history becomes with Trotsky a concretized process. The old mole surfaces in Petrograd, unwittingly delegates its historic vocation to the Bolsheviks, and receives a hiding. The Bolsheviks felt compelled to summon the imagery and metaphor of the French Revolution to explain and legitimate the Bolsheviks' own revolution, because the Bolsheviks, too, were Jacobins. Trotskyism has then become a language of persuasion, of justification, of legitimation, a rhetoric necessarily bound to so-called actually existing socialism. It is in this sense a language of the past, representing a retrospective politics rather than a radical or democratic socialist politics for the West today. This is why so much of Trotskyism's vocabulary is, quote, dead, end quote, metaphor, banal or even fatal. As Susan Sontag has shown, biological metaphor was a staple of Bolshevik discourse, as fundamental to Bolshevik discourse as was its prognostic issue in surgical intervention. Live or vivifying metaphor we can, with Ricoeur, define as that which adds or creates meaning, which allows the intuitive perception of the similar and the dissimilar. Dead, or deceptive metaphor in this context, claims to reveal similarity or identity, for example, between French and Russian history, at the expense of their differences. As Barthes suggests, in its myth function, it naturalizes history, here by making it conform to the putatively general contours of revolution. Ricoeur has argued, after Aristotle, that poetics and rhetoric seek out similarities. History, in contrast, ought perhaps to be conceived as a discourse which seeks out difference. While the creative use of metaphor expands discourse or enlightens an audience, banal or dead metaphor encloses it by appealing to the obvious, the biological, the evolutionary, the great revolution as typology. The function of Trotskyism as a rhetorical historiography is not enlightenment but persuasion. Trotskyism is a discourse of closure, a monologue of resplendent elegance, rather than an invitation to dialogue. Trotskyism, I will argue in this study, functions so as to persuade the audience by means undisclosed, by installing necessitarian devices which sweep the audience into Bolshevik conclusions. This process can be seen in Trotsky's own work, in Trotsky's philosophical and economic premises, in Trotsky's historiography, and in his stand on the Soviet Union, and can be traced through major Trotskyist thinkers like James, Dunayevskaya, Mandel, and especially Deutscher. With Trotsky, we begin.